Welcome to our latest Brexit Central podcast. I'm Darren Grimes, and today I'm coming to you from the heart of the European Union, Brussels. All regular readers of the Brexit Central Daily Briefing will be familiar with how things are progressing from the perspective of the UK. So I'm here today with the Brexit Central team to see firsthand what's going on, meeting with key members of the European Parliament and speaking directly to some of the main players who are going to be influential in shaping the course of the negotiation to come. First up, I'm joined by David McAllister MEP, a German-Scottish politician of the Christian Democratic Union and Vice President of the European People's Party. I began by asking what the mood is in Brussels. I'm keen to find out from the man who is seen as Merkel's man in Brussels and a future potential successor for Chancellor of Germany, what he thinks a future UK-EU relationship will look like.
Angela Merkel wisely said, it's not about punishing the British. It's also not about giving them an extraordinary special treatment. We just have to face reality, and whatever happens, the UK will remain a friend and partner of the European Union, especially of Germany. And we are allies in NATO, we are partners in G7, G20, in the United Nations. And I mean, to leave the European Union from our point of view, is a disappointment. But personally, I believe the Norwegian option would be the best for the UK. However, we've heard the Prime Minister doesn't want to accept European Court of Justice rulings. She wants national control of EU internal migration. Being a member of EFTA and then in the European Economic Area probably won't be possible.
I then asked David McAllister if he believed the rest of his colleagues in the European Parliament and back home in Germany share his desire for an amicable divorce.
I would say most of the colleagues I speak to in the different groups all agree we didn't want this, but there's a saying in Germany, that's why I can use it speaking to British people. Actually, the term "shit happens" is now part of the German language. Yeah. It sounds a bit nicer than "Scheiße passiert." that's too rude, but shit happens. Germans say, "Oh yeah, we know what that means." But well, shit happens. So shit happened, and now let's make the best out of it. And I think the February deal we found last year with the Prime Minister, that was actually the furthest the Europeans could actually go. We see the European Union, which is not only about bringing goods from A to B cross borders without problems, but also that people who want to work can actually do this. And that's why we understand the British position, that they want to change things, but the British also understand our European position.
After David McAllister had made it clear he believed that David Cameron's so-called renegotiation was as far as the EU could possibly go, I told him that the overwhelming British point of view was that David Cameron didn't ask for very much and happened to get even less than that.
This is exactly what I heard. From the British point of view, we heard he didn't ask for much and got even less. But from our point of view,
he asked for a lot.
He asked for a lot, and he got more or less. This wasn't so much a German or Scandinavian issue, but for our Eastern European colleagues, the February deal was the furthest they were ready to go, because the Eastern Europeans were also knew that the Prime Minister was in a difficult situation. So don't underestimate. I mean, if you've got 900,000 Polish citizens living in the UK, of course free movement of people is a very important issue for a Polish Prime Minister.
I then pressed David McAllister to reveal what he believes the ideal EU-UK relationship will be post-Brexit.
I believe in the moment, in the end, it will probably be a free trade agreement plus X. And how big this X is will mainly depend on the British position. It will be a free trade agreement, and then questions will have to be answered. Can the UK still participate in the Erasmus programme, in Horizon 2020, or other things? It wouldn't just be a pure free trade agreement like we have one with Canada, but it would be free trade agreement plus X, and let's cooperate as closely as possible.
With this future free trade agreement in mind, one of the arguments often made here in the UK is that the EU, and Germany in particular, sells a lot more to us than we do to them. So even without accepting free movement of people, it should be relatively easy to secure if the EU is acting in its economic interest. So I asked David McAllister, is the EU bluffing with the threat of tariff?
I mean, nobody's interested in having tariffs, but once again, this will, soft Brexit or hard Brexit, whatever, but let's not make it a nasty Brexit.
Now, Brexit isn't the only thing on the EU's agenda this year. Many want to get on with implementing some of the proposals laid out in the 5 Presidents' report: deeper Eurozone integration, a completing of economic and monetary union, harmonised social policy, as well as a common European army. Some would say it was one step closer to becoming an EU superstate. But is there really a demos fully on board with the EU project? We see anti-Euro parties polling higher than ever before, and anti-EU presidential candidates gaining momentum. So I asked David McAllister, what's next for the European Union with this polarised populace in mind?
Proposals have been made by the report of the 5 presidents, and I think after the French presidential elections and after the German national elections in September, we will have to start a thorough debate about what the 5 presidents have presented. We have a monetary union, but we don't have an economic union. We have to work on this. I'm not talking about a unified economic policy for the whole Eurozone, but we will have to, adjust our tax policy, our labour market policy, and other things.
Armed forces?
Well, that's something else, Eurozone. Well, on defence and security, I know that the UK has always been very sceptical towards ideas of cooperating more closely. From a German point of view, we say, why don't we use the possibilities and the options the Lisbon Treaty offers? The Lisbon Treaty says that member states who want to can cooperate more closely on defence, and I think countries like France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, Spain, Germany, those who want to cooperate closely, they should. But something is very important, not as an alternative or as a competitor to NATO, but under the framework of NATO.
It was reassuring to hear such a measured and rational argument made for a positive UK-EU relationship post-Brexit, recognising that there are opportunities for the EU once the UK is outside. Next up, I'm joined by Saeed Kamal, Member of the European Parliament for London and Chair of the European Conservatives and Reformists since 2014. Against fierce opposition from Number 10, Saeed Kamal came out for Brexit and added a unique perspective to the referendum debate, as someone who understands the way in which the EU operates and negotiates. With this in mind, I wanted to ask Saeed Kamal about the negotiation, what he hopes will achieve from it, and what the realities of that negotiation will be. In a recent article for Brexit Central, Saeed Kamal made clear that he believes the UK should be willing to walk away with WTO rules if the EU offers us a bad deal. So I asked him, how should we approach the negotiation?
I mean, we shouldn't go into negotiations with the aim of end up with WTO. We should be going for as Theresa May has said, a good British deal, not a Swiss option or a Norwegian option or Turkish option, whichever other option. We should be looking for a British option, and it would be in the EU's interest to sign a good deal with the UK. Remember, if we were not members of the EU at the moment, being the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, the 4th largest defence capability, a major exporter, the EU would want to sign a trade agreement with us anyway, and that's the way they should look at it. But at the same time, we can't overplay our hand, and we should also not expect everyone to act rationally. Therefore, if we don't get a deal that's not favourable to us, we shouldn't just say we're so desperate to take any deal, we'll accept it. We should be prepared at some stage in negotiations to say to the EU, we're not happy with this and we're prepared to go to WTO. If we don't do that, then we would be seen as weak and being prepared to accept any deal.
Would Saeed Kamal support a transitional arrangement, or does he fear that the UK may get stuck in a permanent EU loading bay? And what does he think that final agreement should look like?
If we don't dot every I and cross every T, only then should we talk about any sort of transitional agreement. I don't think you go into a negotiation saying we want a transitional agreement, because you have to have an idea of what you're going to transition to. So what we should be doing is going in with a clear idea of what we want to achieve in those negotiations, and if we don't achieve it after 2 years, we have the option: we either fall to WTO, or we agree some transitional agreements until we can, we can part some issues that we can negotiate longer term. But don't start now talking about transitional agreements. If you look at the options that are laid out, the EEA option, the customs union option, the Swiss option, the free trade option, the World Trade Organization option, and as you look at the reasons that people voted to leave, the two main reasons, and there'll be some people who voted for other reasons. The two main reasons was one on migration, either less migration, controlled migration, or fair migration, and also on sovereignty. Given that migration was such an important factor, you cannot continue to have what they call freedom of movement, which means uncontrolled migration from the EU. That would rule out an EA agreement, and that would rule out the Swiss agreement. I suspect what we would have to go for is a UK-EU trade agreement, but let's not forget, this is not a new relationship. We are leaving an existing relationship, and there will be many other areas of mutual cooperation where it will be in our interests. So, for example, we will want to cooperate in some areas of defence. We may want to lend ships, for example, for patrol in the Mediterranean Sea, but that will be in a cooperative agreement. There will also be areas such as sharing intelligence, where it will be in our interests and individual countries of the EU to share intelligence to counter terrorism. And clearly that will be all part of a mixed agreement. So I think it will be trade and some other areas of cooperation.
We heard earlier from David McAllister, who believes David Cameron asked for the most he could have possibly got from the February deal. As someone who understands the way in which negotiations are fleshed out in the EU, how does Saeed Kamal believe the UK should approach the negotiation?
What you go into a negotiation and you draw up your list, and I think that's one of the reasons that Theresa May has taken her time. She's very meticulous, very methodical. She has a great reputation in Brussels from her time as Home Secretary. She was always someone who was on top of her brief. Don't forget that she opted out of some justice and home affairs issues, then opted back in, and people, when I speak to in Brussels, see her as a tough negotiator. So I think she will go in with that idea of that experience of negotiating in Brussels.
I ended by asking Saeed Kamal, as someone who works alongside of colleagues in the European Parliament, what the mood is in Brussels. And does he think the economic realities will prevail, or will the dogmatism of the so-called European ideal win out in the end?
As you'd expect, there's a variety of views. You've got MEPs from 28 different countries, different political groups, 8 political groups in the European Parliament, that people have different views. What was interesting was directly after the referendum, it was a mixture of regret, sadness, anger, a lot of emotions. When we went away for the summer recess and then came back, people started thinking rationally about it, but was still saying to us, look, we can't really talk about anything until you actually invoke Article 50. What's happening now is people are coming to me and saying, we can't have any negotiations or discussions before Article 50, but this is what we would like to see. And people are turning their minds to it. Most people will say they want a good UK-EU agreement and talk about mutual interests as much as possible. There will be some who say we should punish you, and I'm getting from some German MEPs and some French MEPs, not a majority, saying we've got elections coming up. We don't want to make Brexit look easy because that will only encourage what they call the populist parties. They don't want to encourage the Front National in France, or they don't want to encourage the Alternative Deutschland in Germany. So we might get more sense out of them after their respective elections. And also we should realise that the EU is not a monolithic bloc. There are 3 institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, representing the 27 nations. First of all, they're not cleanly united. There was disagreement. I think you saw some of that a few months ago when Guy Verhofstadt from the Parliament threatened to negotiate on his own. But if you look at the way the negotiations will go, the Council leads, that's what it says legally, or the Council has a mandate, but they've given that to the Commission to help them do the heavy lifting. At the end of the day, the European Parliament will have a say. There will be room there for disunity. At the same time, there are also 27 other countries. One of the things I find fascinating when I speak to ministers and prime ministers from other EU countries, the first thing they say to me is that we regret that you voted to leave because we're going to miss you, but actually, please remember our country, whichever country it is, has a strong bilateral relationship with the UK and we want to maintain that. I think the UK government should bear that in mind and we should be nurturing those bilateral relations all the way through the negotiations.
Next up, I was joined by Ashley Fox, leader of the British Conservatives in the European Parliament and a prominent Conservative MEP who backed a Remain vote in the referendum. I wanted to hear his opinion on the negotiation to come and, as a Remain voter, what he sees as the ideal future relationship between the EU and the UK.
I think you get every shade of opinion in the European Parliament. And I would say the majority of colleagues want a constructive relationship with the United Kingdom once we've left. And they want us to trade freely with us. But clearly you do get some who see our departure as a threat to the whole European project. So some colleagues think that by making life as difficult as possible, they might somehow prevent our departure. Or if not, at least act as a warning to anyone else that wants to leave. But I would say those MEPs are in a minority, and I don't detect that amongst the governments of the other EU 27. I don't think anyone wants to damage us deliberately. So the ideal position for us in 2 years' time is that we continue to have free access and tariff-free access to the single market, for goods and for services. And combined with that we then have control over our border policy. Now, if that sounds like having your cake and eating it, then that's probably true. And I think it will be difficult to enjoy the same market access as we have at the moment, combined with control of our borders. Because if we look at this from the EU point of view, they will not want us to enjoy the same advantageous trade terms as we have at the moment and control of borders for fear of setting a bad example to other countries that might leave. So somewhere between the present position and WTO terms, that's where we're going to be. The hardliners in the EU will say if you don't accept freedom of movement of labour, then WTO terms, no deal possible. Others want to be constructive, and there's going to be a negotiation.
So what does Ashley Fox believe the barriers are to achieving that having your cake and eating it position, the freest possible access for goods and services to the EU's internal market, whilst being able to take back control of our immigration policy?
In the EU, they regard the four freedoms as indivisible. So the freedom of movement of goods, services, labour and capital. Now, if you're Norway, for example, you can participate fully in the single market, but in return for that, you will have freedom of movement. Now, if the United Kingdom is going to say, we're going to take control of our borders, I think it's unlikely that we will enjoy the same freedom of movement of goods, services and capital. Now, I think the government's job is to get as close to that as is possible to negotiate, consistent with control of our borders. And I think that, in a nutshell, is what David Davis has to achieve.
So with Ashley Fox sounding relatively optimistic, he doesn't quite believe there will be as much access to the single market as we currently have, but free trade plus X is doable. But the question now is such an agreement possible or achievable within the 2-year timeframe set out in Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty?
My guess is a deal will be done. I don't think March 2019 is our deadline. I think it really is 6 months before that. And that's because we will negotiate an exit agreement which will probably be quite short, and then what you might call a final status agreement, which will encompass trade and how we deal with the other EU states. And I think these agreements can be negotiated in parallel, but the difference is that the trade agreement will need to be ratified by all 35 parliaments in the EU 27. And that's going to take a minimum of 6 months. You can't have a situation where, and I'll give for example, if we have agreed that our departure date is the 1st of April 2019, and it might be a couple of months earlier or a couple of months later, you can't reach the agreement on the 31st of March because there isn't going to be time to ratify that trade deal. So I think, being realistic, you've got to conclude the negotiations at least 6 months before our departure date.
On the issue of ratification of the final agreement, it hadn't actually occurred to me that 35 different parliaments, because you have regional parliaments in the likes of Wallonia, which held up the Canadian EU deal, have to ratify that final agreement. So with that in mind, I then asked Ashley Fox, who's a barrister by trade, to give an explanation on the ratification of the final agreement and which different parts of the EU have to ratify that final deal.
The Council will negotiate and they will set down the guidelines for the negotiation. So once a QMV, a qualified majority of the 27, have reached that position, that will then be the negotiating position. So just as in Britain you have different shades of opinion as to what Brexit should entail, you'll have those different shades of opinion in the EU 27, and they'll have to reach a qualified majority view as to what their position should be. From a British point of view, the more you can put in the exit agreement, the better. That is not subject to unanimous ratification by 34 parliaments, which clearly makes life very difficult indeed. So I think the British will want as much as possible in the exit agreement, but they'll be guided by the lawyers. And it's quite clear that if we do have a comprehensive trade deal with the EU 27, which I would like us to see, then that will be subject to ratification.
Next up, I was joined by Vicky Ford, Conservative MEP and Chair of the European Parliament's Internal Market Committee. As Chair of the Internal Market Committee, I wanted to ask Vicky Ford how she believes the EU can sign trade agreements with the likes of Canada and South Korea without making them be subject to freedom of movement, yet this is a so-called indivisible requirement of access to the single market for the United Kingdom.
Every trade agreement has got some discussion on migration. What's the give and the take? Okay, I find the language that's used about 4 freedoms or none is misunderstanding or misrepresenting some of the divergences that are in how that free movement of people is actually implemented in practice. Other countries like Belgium, where we are today, have much stronger controls on movement even within the EU. And so when I look at this negotiation we're going to have about what sort of access to the single market we want later, and I hear people saying, no access to the single market unless you have free movement, I also say, well, what do you mean by free movement? Many other countries, both within the EU and with special trading relationships with the single market, have also got controls on migration. It shouldn't be able to come without a job. That's the Belgium solution. Shouldn't be able to come and access benefits. Well, Germany is about to say no access to benefits for 5 years. Should offer jobs to local people first. Well, Switzerland's about to introduce that rule, and they've got special access to the single market. Want an overall cap? Well, Liechtenstein has an overall cap. Okay, it's a tiny, tiny country, but maybe we could have, it's the country of the same population of Wisbech. So why can't Wisbech have an overall cap? Wisbech had 1,000 people a year arriving. Liechtenstein's got an overall cap at 190.
And finally, I'm joined by Brexit Central's Deputy Editor, Hugh Bennett. Now, Hugh, do you think members of the European Parliament that we've met with have filled you with confidence for the negotiation to come?
Well, I think it was absolutely fascinating to meet with Saeed Kamal, the leader of the European Conservatives and Reformists, who obviously as leader of a parliamentary group is really quite high up in the European Parliament hierarchy, even though he did actually vote leave himself. He wrote for Brexit Central a couple of weeks back, talking about the right way that Theresa May needed to approach the negotiations, and it was very reassuring to actually see in her speech last week that she seems to have taken a lot of his advice on board, recognising that the European Union isn't this monolithic bloc. There are all these different structures, these different competing interests within it, and speaking the language that the EU is comfortable with, and not stepping on people's toes in terms of Euro-federalist beliefs and things like that. And I think with Theresa May pledging to support European integration in the rest of the EU once Britain leaves, I think that's really struck the right tone.
It's been reported that she's even going to tell Donald Trump support EU integration.
Yeah, and I think the election of Donald Trump has really changed the mood in the EU towards Britain, who from seeing Britain as this rogue state that's going to leave and destabilise the EU, they suddenly see Britain as actually the best force for actually sort of bringing Donald Trump round to the EU's point of view, maintaining its respect for NATO, support for the EU's eastern borders against Russia. So I think the EU recognises what an important role Britain has to play in mediating between it and Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the key takeaways were from the variety of MEPs that we met with?
Yeah, well, I think speaking to the German MEP David McAllister, who's a former regional prime minister in Germany, and he's seen as very close to Angela Merkel. As
potential successor, even.
Oh, yeah, indeed. But he's often described as Merkel's voice in Brussels. And when we were talking with him about all the different sort of Brexit deals that would be on the table, he thought the most likely outcome would be a free trade agreement plus X. The idea is going to be a bit like a Canada deal, but with probably more provisions for things like financial services and closer cooperation on defence and security, things like Horizon and Erasmus.
And finally, in light of your analysis, what level of progress do you think we can expect in the coming months?
Well, I think the key thing to remember here is that Brexit is only one of a large number of problems the EU is actually facing at the moment. It's currently got elections coming up in the Netherlands, France and Germany, where the EU is terrified about the rise of populist leaders, people like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen in France, the AfD in Germany. The EU really wants to do everything it can to make sure that they don't perform strongly in these elections. And I think one of the ways it wants to do that is by making it appear that Brexit is going as badly as possible. So I think, publicly we may well see a hardening of the stance from the EU. They'll want to be looking very uncompromising, making it look like the negotiations are going to be extremely difficult in order to discourage these other parties from trying to build a platform on the idea that it's easy to leave the European Union, in a hope that it stems support from flowing to these parties in France, Germany and the Netherlands. But I think after the German elections are over in September, I think that's when we will start to see progress being made. And in terms of the sort of big compromises we can expect, obviously the EU likes to talk a lot about free movement, the four freedoms. Free movement is inextricably linked to free trade in goods and services. Firstly, you can already see this isn't true in practice. The EU has free trade agreements with a huge number of countries around the world that it doesn't have free movement of people with. As we were speaking to Vicky Ford earlier in Brussels, and she was pointing out that actually when you look around the EU, there are a lot of countries that sort of almost sneakily through the back door find ways of getting around the EU's free movement rules. You look at Belgium, which has rules which prevent people from renting a house or claiming benefits unless they have a social security number, which they can only get if they have a job in advance. So it basically stops people coming to Belgium unless they already have a job. You've got in Germany, I think they're looking at laws to stop migrants from claiming benefits, and the Austrian Chancellor has called for a law to prioritise Austrian jobs for Austrian workers. So the idea that there is this perfect free movement utopia that exists inside the EU, this simply isn't the case. And I think this is something that the EU realises it is going to have to compromise on, not only within its own borders, but when it looks at a deal with Britain in the future.
Finally, Hugh, sum up in a few words for us everything that you've taken away from your time in Brussels.
Brexit has served as a wake-up call to a lot of people within the EU. Of course, there remain the dedicated, hardcore bunch of people who are going to carry on ploughing the Euro-federalist furrow for forever. But I think amongst the vast majority of MEPs and people in the EU, there's a sense of realism, of pragmatism, which has descended. The idea that, yes, Brexit is happening, and they need to make a success of it as much as Britain does. They want to have a successful negotiation that leaves the UK and the EU able to cooperate as strong partners after Brexit. No ideas about punishment. It's about working to get the best outcome for both sides. And I think overall we can be very positive that common sense will prevail in the negotiations, and the future of the UK and the EU will be one that both sides can move forward positively with.
Well, only time will tell. Bring on Article 50, I say. Now, don't forget, Brexit Central podcast listeners, you can get all of the latest Brexit news, analysis, comment and insight by signing up to your daily Brexit briefing at brexitcentral.com.